Hello, hot stuff. Hello, and welcome to another video. My name is Heather, and as always, I'm reading with a vengeance, and as always, I hope you are as well. If you've been here before, thank you so much for coming back. If you're new to my channel, a very warm welcome to you. I'm happy to have you here. Today, I'm going to talk about my 5 favorites of the third quarter of the year. And Jake would like to say hello. This is the third in the series of my 5 top reads of the quarter this year. And you're wondering, well, there's going to be a 4th, right? Because there are 4 quarters in the year. But there's really, I don't think I'm going to do the 4th quarter. Am I talking about football? Because by the time, of course, the end of the year gets here, that's when I do, of course, my favorite reads of the year. And I think just kind of doing back to back, oh, here are my top 5 for the 4th quarter, and here are my top however many I'm going to do for the year. I'm not going to do that. So, but these are my 5 favorites that I have read in between July, August, and September. So I've already talked about these books. You've probably already heard of them if you watch my channel, but what you might notice also if you watch my channel before and you kind of, I don't know, if you retain what star ratings I give books, sometimes I'll give a 4-star rating kind of a higher favoritism than maybe a 5-star rating. I don't know why that is. I really don't. I mean, maybe someday I'll sit down and analyze how I rate books, why I rate them the way I do. But for now, if for some reason you watch some of my other videos and say, well, she only gave that one 4 stars and it's on this list, and she gave this one 5 stars and it's not on this list, I got nothing for you. I really don't have an answer to that, but that's neither here nor there. Let's talk about the 5 books that I did pick for my favorite of the third quarter of 2022. First on this list is The Paper Palace by Miranda Cowley Heller. This book came onto my radar because of the Women's Prize for Fiction. I followed it for the first time this year, had a really good time. I probably would not have picked it up had it not been for the prize, and I'm so glad I did. This book follows Elle, and the book opens up in the first chapter. You know quite a bit about Elle. You know she's happily married. She's got 3 beautiful children. She's got a good circle of friends, and she's got a best friend who has been her friend since childhood, Jonas. They're all at a get-together together. Jonas's family is with Elle's family. Everybody's in the house. They're all having a good time. And then Elle and Jonas sneak out and they have sex for the very first time outside while their families are inside. And you know right away, yeah, that Elle is unfaithful to her husband. Now, I know for some readers, this is a turnoff right away. Like, they don't like to read about infidelity. I get it. I don't think this story glorifies infidelity. It just talks about human relationships and being human and making mistakes and things that can lead to poor decisions. With that being said, this book is beautifully written. I mean, this is literary fiction, so it's not like there's this huge plot. It's just about Elle's decisions. After this event happens in the first chapter, then the way the book is structured is you kind of go back in time and you even meet Elle's mother, and you talk a little bit about Elle's childhood, a lot about Elle's childhood actually, and you get to know Elle and how she meets Jonas and their friendship and how that evolves and why it goes a certain direction and why doesn't it go this direction. And then Elle meeting her husband and their relationship and all these events that kind of culminate and lead to this event on this night between Elle and Jonas and the decision that Elle needs to make as far as who she chooses. And I thought it was brilliantly done. And I think I gave it a 5-star rating on Goodreads because they don't do half stars, but I think my rating was 4.5 stars. I can't remember why it didn't get the 5 stars, but I really, really loved this book. And yeah, I highly recommend it. By the way, this is in no particular order. I would absolutely be hard pressed to put these in order. These are just books that I absolutely loved. Okay, let's move on. The next book I have spoken about recently, I would say this is the most recent. The next two books that I'm going to talk about are the most recent books that I've read. I read them in September. The next one is The Guardians by John Grisham. This is the second John Grisham book that I've read in a row that was a 5-star read that had kind of a similar theme and that I absolutely loved. The Guardians follows Cullen Post, and he is a founder of an Innocence Project. He's an attorney, but he's also a minister. And it's this organization who helps people who have been wrongfully convicted and are wallowing on death row or just in prison for the rest of their lives. Specifically, the main case that you're following in this story is the story of Quincy, who has been wrongfully convicted of killing his divorce attorney. He's in prison. I can't remember if he's actually on death row. I think he's just in prison for the rest of his life. So Cullen takes his case, but the more he works on this case, kind of bad stuff starts to happen. And it turns out that not only was Quincy wrongfully convicted, he was framed, and he was framed by some pretty powerful people who don't want Quincy exonerated. So the closer that Cullen gets to the truth and finding out what actually happened and why Quincy was framed, the more danger he's in. And it is a page turner. I absolutely love this book. And if you love a legal thriller, you perhaps have already read it by now, because John Grisham, I think, is a master of legal thrillers. And this is no exception, so I highly recommend it. I think I ultimately gave Guardians 5 stars. The next book I'll talk about as in my top 5 for the third quarter is also a recent read. So I recently talked about it. I read it in September, and that is Descent by Tim Johnston. This one took me by surprise in kind of a weird way. I actually have been wanting to read it for a really long time. My husband read it like 2 years ago. I put it on my TBR, and he told me that I would like it. So it's been sitting on my shelf and languishing, and I finally picked it up because it had kind of a dark theme. And of course I was keeping it for the spooky season to read. And it's funny, I expected to like it, but then when I started reading it, it had a very slow beginning. And I remember stopping like probably 25 pages in or something like that, and looking up my husband's rating on Goodreads. I'm like, yeah, he gave it 4 stars, and he doesn't give high ratings willy-nilly. And then I asked him, I'm like, do you remember this book? And he's like, remind me of what it's about. And I told him, and he's like, oh yeah, it is good. Keep reading. And I'm like, okay, because I almost DNF'd it. So it does, I will warn you, it does have a slow beginning, but then this follows the Cortland family, and it's basically mother, father, the older daughter, Caitlin, who I think is 18 at the beginning of the story, and her younger brother, who I think is 3 years younger than she is, Sean. Caitlin is a track star, and she is on her way to go to college on a running scholarship, and they decide to take a summer trip, last kind of family trip together to Colorado, this mountain cabin. And one morning, Caitlin gets up to go for a run, and she brings Sean with her, and he follows her on his bike. And something terrible happens, and only Sean comes out of the woods. You follow multiple perspectives of how this tragic event affects the entire family, and how it affects each of them individually. And those stories are really fascinating just themselves. You ultimately find out what happened to Caitlin, and you ultimately get her perspective, and that's an exciting story as well. But the story of the other 3 characters that are left behind, the mom, she pretty much breaks down, and she goes back home to Wisconsin to deal with this herself, and initially to take care of the younger son, Sean. But then Sean ends up leaving home and going on his journey. He goes on this road trip, and stuff happens to him. But the father, he stays behind in Colorado. He wants to find Caitlin, and he never gives up, and he ends up staying there for several years. He goes through a journey of his own, and he meets some people some local people. He's helping an older man by staying on his ranch and kind of taking care of him and befriends him, and this older man, his ne'er-do-well son, comes back into the picture, and lots going on in this book. The last 100 pages of the book absolutely make up for the first 50 pages. If you can get past those first 50 pages, this book will really carry you into this world where it is quite a ride. This book is marketed as a thriller. It's not really a thriller until like the last 100 pages, but the family drama that goes on in the middle is absolutely worth the read. I think I gave it 4 stars, but yeah, absolutely a favorite of mine. My 4th favorite read of the 3rd quarter is The Dutch House by Ann Patchett. This one was made even better because I listened to it and it's narrated by Tom Hanks. And let me tell you, it's not like I was a huge Tom Hanks fan before I listened to it, but if he narrates anything else, I will listen to it. He did such a phenomenal job narrating this book. This follows Danny and Maeve. They are brother and sister. As children, their father bought this big ornate house and thought his wife would absolutely love it. She hated it and she left the family. And basically this story follows Danny and Maeve and how that affects their lives. They are, I believe, I want to say Maeve is, I don't know, she's like 10 or something when the mom leaves. And Danny is a couple of years younger. I can't remember the ages, but they're fairly young. And then a stepmother comes into the picture and the stepmother doesn't like Danny and Maeve and ultimately ejects them from the house. And this follows their story. It's a family saga over, I want to say, 5 decades. It's told from the point of view of Danny. He adores his sister adores him, and that is a wonderful story in and of itself. If you like listening to stories about brother-sister relationships, this is perfect. There's humor in this, as well as heartbreak, and it's just one of those emotionally compelling stories. If you have any interest in it and you like listening to books, I would absolutely recommend that you listen to the audio by Tom Hanks. You won't regret it. It was fantastic. I gave this one 4 stars. Finally, my 5th favorite book of the 3rd quarter of 2022 is November Road by Berney. This was a book that had sat on my shelf for a couple of years. My friend sent it to me. She got it as a book of the month. And I finally read it mostly because I was trying to get through all my hardcovers to make space. And so, yeah, it was a happy surprise. This follows Frank Guidry, and it takes place right around the time JFK is assassinated. And there is a link there, but the assassination doesn't have too much to do with the plot. There is a link. It takes place at that time frame. Frank Guidry is basically kind of a top lieutenant of the New Orleans mob scene. It is portrayed in the book that the New Orleans mob had something to do with JFK's assassination. And because Frank Guidry is aware of that, he realizes that his days are numbered, that the mob is going to get rid of everybody who knows anything about the mob's link to the assassination. So Frank is on the run, and he is on the road trying to get away, trying to keep from getting dead. There's a second storyline about Charlotte and her 2 young children. She is running away from her basically dead-end life. She's married to a man who he doesn't abuse her, but he doesn't really respect her, and she just doesn't feel fulfilled. And she also wants to bring her children up in a good environment where there's joy and culture and light and life. And so she's on the run as well. So Frank and Charlotte's lives on the run, on the road, converge. They meet for reasons. They decide to carpool in this adventure, this road trip adventure. It talks about their adventure and their escaping, the lives that they're escaping. And then there's also a third perspective. It's somewhat minor but significant. Minor but significant. Does that even make sense? You don't follow that perspective as frequently as Frank and Charlotte's, but it is a significant perspective. And it's basically the perspective of another assassin who's on Frank's tail, who has been sent by the the mob to get rid of Frank. And that's thrilling. But this was a page turner. I couldn't put this down. I read it very quickly. While I am not a fan, I've talked about this before, I am not really a huge fan of romance novels, and this is not a romance novel by any stretch of the imagination. But there is, not to spoil, I don't think it's a spoiler, I think you kind of see it coming, but there is a kind of a romance in here that is absolutely a romance I can get behind. Mostly it is suspenseful, dare I say thrilling? I mean, it is kind of thrilling. I couldn't put it down. This was a 5-star read for me, and I highly recommend it. So that is it. Those are my 5 favorites for the third quarter of 2022. Have you read any of these? Did you agree or disagree with my assessment of these books? I would love to hear about it. Please feel free to comment down in the doodly-doo. You know how I love to hear from you guys. Do you guys have some favorites that you can recommend to me? I am always open to suggestions. Please also put that down in the doodly-doo. If you're still watching at this point, please consider giving that like button a boop, and a subscribe would be really great. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you being here, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.